The naturalist claim is self-refuting. For consider the statement, quote, "We should only believe what can be scientifically proven," end quote. Can that statement be scientifically proven? Well, obviously not. And thus the scientific naturalist's position refutes itself, and so it cannot be true.
And so we want to begin by looking at what I call epistemological objections. Now, epistemology is a big word that you should learn that means theory of knowledge. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we know things. It comes from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. And so these arguments are basically rooted in the impossibility of having a knowledge of God's existence, that somehow the evidence isn't enough, or that it isn't rational to believe in God. These are arguments based upon theism not meeting the requirements for knowledge. So that's why I call them epistemological objections, that somehow theism, or the belief that God exists, just doesn't measure up to what we call knowledge. Now, the first challenge that I want to think about with you is called Verificationism. Verificationism was a philosophy that was dominant during the first half of the 20th century in the Anglo-American world. It belonged, well, so much for that one. Let me try this marker. It belonged to a school of thought, well, okay.
We'll look on the other side. See if there's another.
No, there's not. So I will just tell you the words, and Marion will have to figure out how to spell them as best she can. They belong to a school called Logical Positivism. And basically what Logical Positivism tried to say is that religious beliefs or other types of beliefs like this are unverifiable through the five senses, and therefore they're meaningless. Okay, here's a green one. Thanks, Bob. Let's see. Logical Positivism said that religious beliefs are unverifiable through the five senses, and therefore they are meaningless. And they championed something called the verification principle of meaning. The verification principle of meaning. According to the verification principle of meaning, an informative sentence, in order to be meaningful, must be capable of being empirically verified. Let me repeat that. An informative sentence, in order to be meaningful, must be capable of being empirically verified. That is to say, you have to be able to verify it through your five senses. And if it cannot be empirically verified, then the statement isn't false. It's meaningless. It's neither true nor false. It's just a meaningless combination of words. Thank you, Marion. Whoops. Thank you. That's all right. So, since statements like God exists, or God loves me, or God sent His Son into the world, were, in the view of the verificationists, not capable of being verified through the five senses, they said that they're meaningless. It would be like saying, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." You know, it's just meaningless. It's not false. It doesn't even have the dignity to be false. It's just meaningless. And this verification principle went through a number of revisions. One of them was called the falsification principle. And according to the falsification principle, a meaningful sentence must be capable, in principle, of being falsified. That is to say, there must be some empirical test that you could perform in principle that would show the statement to be false. And if there's nothing you could do to prove it was false, then the sentence was just meaningless. And the prospects for religious language under the falsification principle were no brighter than under the verification principle, because these thinkers believed that there is no conditions under which religious statements could be falsified or verified, because they were just totally non-empirical. That is to say, they were about entities that aren't discernible by the five senses, like God. God loves me. There's nothing you can do to empirically verify that or falsify it through your five senses. Any question about those two principles before I illustrate one of them? All right. So to give an example, there was a symposium held at Oxford University in 1948 called Theology and Falsification, which featured the famous British philosopher Anthony Flew. And Flew borrowed a story that he had heard from another philosopher to illustrate the falsification principle in operation against religious language. He said, let's imagine that there were two explorers working their way through the jungle, and they come upon a clearing in the jungle in which they find a patch of flowers growing. And the one explorer is convinced that this patch of flowers is in fact a garden that has been planted there by some gardener who tends it. And the other philosopher says, well, no, this is just a natural clearing in the jungle in which some flowers happen to grow. And so in the story that Flew tells, they try to find the gardener. They camp out near the clearing, but no gardener is ever seen. They set up electrical tripwires around the clearing, and no alarms ever go off. They're never able to find any trace of the gardener. And in order to save his hypothesis that there is a gardener, the one explorer has to continually revise his hypothesis by saying, well, maybe the gardener is an invisible gardener, or maybe he's intangible and so never trips the electrical fence. It's an undetectable gardener. And finally, in frustration, the other explorer replies, well, just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from no gardener at all? Well, the gardener in the story is obviously a symbol of God. And the idea here is that an intangible, undetectable, eternally elusive God is no different than no God at all. And so the story was meant to illustrate the meaninglessness of the God hypothesis, just as the gardener hypothesis was said to be meaningless. Now, as you think about this story, I think we would all agree that the gardener hypothesis had, in fact, suffered death by 1,000 qualifications, as Flew put it. It had become so revised and contrived that it was no longer plausible. But why does that disqualify the gardener hypothesis? What was wrong with that? Well, I think the answer is that the gardener hypothesis becomes increasingly and increasingly contrived to fit the results. In other words, it becomes what is sometimes called ad hoc. Ad hoc is Latin meaning to this. And it means, in a sense, that the hypothesis becomes tailored to the facts. You see, it doesn't explain the facts. Just whatever the facts are, you just adjust the hypothesis to fit it. So it becomes increasingly ad hoc, and therefore is not a good explanation. To give an illustration in science, in the late 19th century, physicists believed that light was carried by an invisible medium called the ether, just as waves in the ocean are carried by water, or sound waves are carried by the air. So they thought light was waves in this invisible medium of the ether. But attempt after experimental attempt failed to detect any presence of the ether. And the concept of the ether got continually revised and revised. It was said, well, maybe the ether somehow binds to the earth and travels along the earth with it like an atmosphere, so that's why we can't detect our motion through the ether. Or maybe the ether has certain intangible properties that prevent us from detecting it. And it finally got so contrived and revised that the ether became no different than nothing at all. It was just revised and contrived right out of existence. So the ether hypothesis became so ad hoc and contrived that it was abandoned by modern physics. Now, in exactly the same way, this Gardner hypothesis is an unacceptable hypothesis because it becomes so artificially tailored to the facts and contrived that it becomes unacceptably ad hoc. But what Flew was arguing was that the Gardner hypothesis was meaningless. And that's very different, you see. To say the hypothesis is unacceptable because it's contrived or ad hoc is not to say that it's meaningless. Flew seemed to think that the conditions for falsifying a hypothesis were part of the meaning of the hypothesis. The conditions for falsifying it were part of what the hypothesis meant. And so if there were no conditions that would falsify it, the hypothesis was literally meaningless. Well, that's obviously wrong, because the very fact that the two explorers were able to disagree on their hypothesis shows that they clearly understood each other. The problem with the Gardner hypothesis was not that it was meaningless. It was that it was false. It was ad hoc. But it was clearly meaningful because the explorers could argue about it, and they could set up tests to try to detect the Gardner. So they clearly understood it, and similarly the God hypothesis is one we clearly understand. We understand what it means to say God loves me or God created the world. The question then is not whether those hypotheses are meaningless, but in this case whether it's unacceptably ad hoc or not. So the Gardner story that he gave really failed to show, I think, that religious statements, if they're unverifiable or unfalsifiable, are meaningless. Now, is there any question or comment about that before I go further? Do you understand why this parable or story doesn't show it to be meaningless? Yes?
When did the convention take place in 48?
Oxford University. It was a symposium called Theology and Falsification. All right. Well, in general, the verification principle of meaning suffered two debilitating weaknesses. First of all, the principle was too restrictive. It was too restrictive a criterion of meaning. It was very quickly realized by epistemologists or theorists of knowledge that if you follow this principle, it would force you to regard as meaningless vast stretches of human discourse and language, including not just religious statements, but ethical statements, aesthetic statements, metaphysical statements, and in the end, even scientific statements. There are a lot of statements in science that are not verifiable or falsifiable in and of themselves, so that the principle would just be utterly unreasonable because it would be far too restrictive. We clearly have meaningful discourse in areas of human language which are not subject to either verification or falsification. But secondly, and this was the especially damning criticism, it turned out that the verification principle is self-refuting. It's self-refuting. For just to ask yourself the question, is this statement verifiable or falsifiable? A meaningful sentence must be verifiable. Is that verifiable? Well, no. There's no scientific test, no experiment you could perform to determine this, the truth of this. And therefore, the verification principle turns out by its own criterion to be just a meaningless combination of words. That sentence has no meaning by its own criterion. And therefore, there's no reason to be bothered by it, no reason to be troubled by it. Or at best, it would just be an arbitrary definition which we're at liberty to reject. And indeed, not a very good definition because, as I said in point one, it's evident that there are vast stretches of human language and discourse which are meaningful even though they're not verifiable or falsifiable. And therefore, by the second half of the 20th century, the verification principle had collapsed under the deficiencies of its own incoherence. It was self-refuting, self-referentially incoherent. It refuted itself, and therefore logical positivism and its verification principle collapsed. And what happened in the second half of the 20th century then is there has been a revival of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the area of philosophy that asks about the nature of ultimate reality and talks about issues that are beyond empirical verification, beyond your five senses. And with this renaissance of metaphysics has come as well a renaissance of philosophy of religion, and particularly Christian philosophy of religion. So in large measure, the contemporary burst of activity, this renaissance of interest in philosophy of religion, is due to the collapse of logical positivism and verificationism in the second half of the 20th century. Sadly, however, I find in speaking at universities, you will still hear people espousing this kind of verificationism, particularly people in the sciences who were educated, back in the 40s and 50s, or students who were educated under those type of men and have never done any work in epistemology outside of that. And you need to help gently explain to these folks that they're just out of touch. They're completely out of date, and that for those two reasons that I just gave, this verificationist theory of meaning is just untenable. Yes, Cindy. Yeah. What that person is talking about, Cindy, is not science. What he's talking about is logical positivism. And that's what you need to help the person see. Say, you're not talking about science. You're talking about a philosophy of science called verificationism. And if you adopt this verificationist epistemology, you will destroy science. You can tell this person, because science itself has unverifiable statements in it. Let me just give you one, okay, if you need an example. In science, there's a principle called the Copernican principle, which says that we occupy no special place in the universe. That is to say, that the laws of nature that we observe governing Earth are the same laws of nature that govern Andromeda and the distant galaxies that we see. But there's no way to prove that. There's no way to prove that there's not a wholly different set of laws of nature that govern the other galaxies. We simply have to assume in science, in order to do science, that the same laws of nature that obtain here obtain there. And that's called the Copernican principle. It's a foundational assumption of science. It cannot be proved scientifically. So if you only believe in things that are empirically verifiable, you have to reject the Copernican principle, and you completely destroy science. And as I say, this is not a Christian critique. This principle in positivism succumbed under the criticism of secular philosophers of science who realized that this theory of meaning was too restrictive. And then, as well, you point out to your friend the other point was that there are truths that are not accessible by science, like ethical truths and aesthetic truths and truths about the nature of the world, like, for example, that there is an external world. Remember, I gave examples earlier that you cannot prove scientifically that you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals being stimulated by electrodes.
Using the five senses, yes, I can, for me, because I can see myself, I can touch myself. I'm using my five senses to verify that I'm in fact here.
Well, but see, that wouldn't work, Cindy, if on a strict verificationist view, because if you were a brain in a vat of chemicals, you would have exactly those same sensations. Your feeling yourself is nothing but the sensation of your nerve endings in your brain. You don't have to actually have a body to have the feeling that you're touching a body. All you have to do is have those nerve sensations. And if you're wired up with electrodes in a vat of chemicals, your brain is, he can make you feel your body, see these other people, hear them, all of that. So, again, I'm not trying to make you a skeptic, but what I'm trying to say is that if you adopt the epistemology that you only believe what can be empirically verified, you won't believe in those kind of metaphysical truths like there is an external world, which is crazy. So you show the person that it's too restrictive, and then you also show them that it would undermine itself. Okay, I'll take one more question, and then I have to let you go because we're over time. I'm sorry. Yes? Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that illustration up. I had forgotten about that, but the movie Contact, I think, is a brilliant critique of verificationism. And especially what I like is when she has that vision of the cosmos, and she cries, "I never knew, I never knew." And it's like a person when he first comes to know Christ, first comes to know God. And you go back and you try to tell people, it's real. You know, God is real, He's there. And they say, show me the evidence, you'll prove it. And you're at a loss for words. And yet you've experienced that self-authenticating presence of the divine in the same way she did in the movie. And I thought that was a beautiful illustration of just the inadequacies of this kind of verificationism. So that's a good cultural bridge. If you can talk to someone, say, hey, did you see the movie Contact? It's just like that. I think that's very helpful. All right, well, next time we'll come back and look at the presumption of atheism, and I hope to show that indeed atheism is very presumptuous, and that we have no reason to presume it's true.
The copyright for the content of this recording is held by Dr. William Lane Craig. For more, go to reasonablefaith.org.